The last days of 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge was raging, snow was falling all over the European jungle. Jack Thompson, a young American soldier from Texas, was trudging through the snow-covered pine trees. He was separated from his unit after a fierce artillery barrage. His M1 Garand rifle was heavy on his shoulder, but his body was shivering from the cold. Jack was only 22 years old, fighting for freedom, but now he only thought about surviving the night. The snowstorm caught him, his vision blurred, and he collapsed under a large tree. Not far away, Hans Müller, a German private from Berlin, was also struggling with the storm. Hans was 24 years old, had been drafted into the army, and now he had a leg injury after a clash. His MP-40 was still there, but his ammunition was exhausted. Hans trudged on, blood seeping through his makeshift bandages, and found a small cave that provided shelter from the wind. When Jack stumbled upon the cave, they met. Their eyes met in the flickering light of Jack's last match. "Amerikaner," Hans whispered, his hand tightening on his gun. Jack raised the barrel, his heart pounding, but the blizzard outside was too strong for either of them to dare fire. The sound might attract other enemies, or they were simply too tired. They looked at each other, and in that moment, they both realized death from cold was faster than death by bullet. They sat in silence, a few meters apart, sharing the warmth of the small fire. Jack tossed Hans a piece of dry bread from his backpack. Hans returned with a German cigarette. There was no word, only the howling wind and falling snow. That night, they fell asleep, not knowing what the next day would bring. The next morning, the snow was still falling, covering everything in white. Jack woke up first, saw Hans trying to bandage his wound. He hesitated, then gave Hans some antiseptic from the American first aid kit. Hans took it, nodded his thanks in German, "Dank." Jack didn't understand, but the gesture was enough to keep them from shooting each other immediately. They decided to stay in the cave, because going out would mean freezing to death. But the tension was still there. Jack thought of Hans as the enemy, the Nazi he had been taught to kill. Hans thought of Jack as the invading Yankee who was destroying his homeland. They began to communicate through gestures and a few broken English words Hans had learned from the prisoners. Jack asked about Hans's family, and Hans told him about his mother in Berlin under bombardment. Jack shared about the Texas farm where he dreamed of returning after the war. But then conflict breaks out when Hans tries to take Jack's gun to examine it. Jack pushes him away, shouting, "Don't touch it." They wrestle in the snow, but Hans's wound weakens him. Finally, they stop, panting. Jack realizes Hans is no monster, just a guy like him. They share their meager food. Jack has Hershey's chocolate. Hans has German rye bread. That night, they take turns keeping watch, still suspicious, but beginning to realize their similarities. Both fear death, both miss home. The snow falls more heavily, obscuring their tracks, leaving them completely isolated. They use tree branches to make a makeshift shelter, and for the first time, they laugh when Hans tries to teach Jack the word Schnee for snow. On the third day, the snowstorm was still raging, but food was running out. Jack and Hans realized they had to cooperate if they wanted to survive. They used rifles to hunt wild animals. Jack was more accurate because of his experience hunting in Texas. They set traps for rabbits together, and when they caught one, they split the meat over the fire. Hans taught Jack how to make a smokeless fire, avoiding detection. Jack shared how to properly bandage a wound, which helped ease the pain in Hans's leg. They began to talk more. Hans talked about his dream of being an engineer before the war. Jack talked about the American music he loved. They played homemade chess made from twigs and rocks, laughing when Hans won. The snow kept falling, turning the forest into a world of white. But in the cave, the warmth of their new friendship blossomed. One night, when a small avalanche nearly buried the cave, they escaped together, saving each other from death. Jack pulled Hans out of the snow, and for the first time, they hugged like brothers. "Freund," Hans said, meaning friend. Jack nodded, forgetting they were enemies. They dreamed of peace, but war was still out there, with the distant sound of artillery as a reminder. The next week, The snowfall slowed, but they were still stuck. They shared memories. Hans talked about Christmas in Germany with the Christmas tree and cookies. Jack sang Silent Night in English, and Hans sang along in German. They realized the songs were the same, and tears rolled down their cheeks. They talked about their fears: fear of dying, fear of losing, fear of not going home. Hans confessed that he didn't support Hitler, he was just forced to. Jack talked about the friends he lost in the Battle of Normandy. One day, they heard Allied planes flying over, and Jack wanted to fire a flare for help, but Hans begged him not to. He was afraid of being taken prisoner. Their inner conflict arose, but they chose to stay together. Together, they built a sturdier hut out of snow and branches, and shared their dreams for after the war. Jack wanted to go back to the farm, Hans wanted to rebuild Berlin. The falling snow serves as a reminder of the fragility of life, but their friendship grows stronger. After 2 weeks, the snow stopped falling, and the gunshots grew closer. The American unit was advancing. Jack and Hans knew the time had come to say goodbye. They hugged, exchanged family addresses, promising to keep in touch after the war. "Good luck, Freund," Jack said. Hans nodded. "Auf Wiedersehen." Hans trudged toward Germany, Jack toward America. But as Hans was gone, a gunshot rang out in the distance. Jack had no idea what had happened. Many years later, Jack returned to Texas, received a letter from Hans's mother. He had died in the last battle, but always spoke of the American friend who saved his life. Jack cried. And every time snow fell in Texas, which was rare, he thought of the Ardennes. The war was over, but that friendship lived on, proving that among enemies, there was still humanity.